Welcome to Dead Quiet Mysteries, the place where every cold case, chilling crime, and unsolved mystery is brought back to life. From vanished persons to twisted betrayals, we dig deep into the unknown to uncover the truth that others left buried. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us which city and country you're watching from. We love seeing how far the mystery travels. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon so you never miss a case. Because here, some truths are only heard in the dead quiet. Hercule Poirot and the Whisper Beneath the Sycamore. Chapter 1. The Falling Leaves. It was a Tuesday morning in early October when we arrived in Maplebridge, a quiet, unspoilt village nestled at the edge of the Kentish Weald, where the trees had just begun to turn to gold. The journey from London had taken only 2 hours by train and trap, but the atmosphere into which we descended might as well have belonged to another century. The air was soft and fragrant with wood smoke, and the rustling of dry leaves accompanied us like a whisper wherever we walked. We had come at the invitation of Reverend Simon Hallis, an old acquaintance of Poirot's who had written a letter to him some weeks earlier. I had not read the letter myself, but from Poirot's mild frown and the careful way he folded the page afterwards, I gathered it was not a mere social call. Still, when I pressed him, he simply smiled and said, "Come, Lord Hastings. A few days in the country will do your nerves good, and mine too, perhaps, if the local scones are not too dry." So here we were, stepping through the iron gate of the Maplebridge vicarage, our breath visible in the crisp air. The Reverend Hallis, a soft-spoken man with a stoop and kind eyes, met us at the door and ushered us into a snug parlour already scented with clove and orange peel. "I'm so very grateful you could come," he said as he poured out the tea. "You see, it's difficult to explain. There is no crime exactly, no theft, no body, nothing that would justify the presence of a detective." Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, but that is just it, mon ami. You would not write to Hercule Poirot merely because the sheep are restless. There is a disturbance, yes?" Hallis hesitated. "There is a woman, Miss Nell Langdon. She lives at Sycamore House, just past the orchard. She has lived alone for nearly 10 years, since her friend, Miss Wynne, passed away. The villagers treat her with pity, respect even, but I suspect it is a quiet sort of fear." "Fear of what?" I asked, curious. "She talks to the dead, Captain Hastings, or so they say. She walks in the orchard at dusk and speaks to someone who is no longer there. And she says she is waiting for Beatrice to come home." Poirot was silent. His hands, gloved and immaculate, rested on the tea tray. "And you think this is, how do you say, a disorder of the mind?" he asked. "I don't know what I think," Hallis replied honestly. "Only that something has settled over Maplebridge this autumn, like a fog, and I fear it stems from Sycamore House." Poirot nodded once, gravely. "Then we shall walk, n'est-ce pas, Hastings? Let us acquaint ourselves with the village." The walk into the heart of Maplebridge took us past mossy stone cottages, thatched roofs, and the low brick wall of the old schoolhouse. Children's laughter floated through the air as leaves crunched underfoot. We passed the greengrocer's, the bakery, and a small post office where a tabby cat dozed on the windowsill. Everywhere we went, Poirot observed with quiet intensity. He noticed how people smiled and nodded, but none stopped to speak. They glanced at us, yes, and then quickly away. At one point, as we passed the notice board announcing the upcoming harvest festival, a little girl paused in the path and whispered something to her mother, who hushed her and hurried on. "Odd," I murmured. "They're not unfriendly, but they are expectant," Poirot said. "They wait for something to break the stillness, and they hope it will not be them." We continued down a narrowing lane lined with hedgerows until we reached a wooden gate and a weathered sign reading Sycamore House. The house beyond was a charming vine-covered affair, 2 stories with tall windows and a steep roof. Behind it lay the orchard, wild with weeds save for one space of carefully cleared ground beneath a sprawling sycamore tree. "Ah," Poirot breathed, stopping at the gate. "There is the heart of it, mon cher Hastings. This is not madness. It is grief that has not been permitted to die." Just then the front door creaked open, and a woman stepped out. She was tall, with grey-streaked hair coiled at the nape of her neck, and a faded blue cardigan that hung too loosely from her shoulders. Her eyes, when they met ours, were pale and soft, like washed sky. "You must be Mr. Poirot," she said gently. "The Reverend sent word." Poirot bowed slightly. "Miss Langdon, may we speak?" She hesitated, then nodded. "There's tea in the kitchen." The house smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paper. We sat at a scrubbed pine table while Miss Langdon moved slowly about the room, boiling water, setting out cups, a plate of shortbread. She never rushed, never raised her voice, and yet there was a peculiar absence about her, as though part of her mind were in another room. "It's kind of you to come," she said after a moment. "I've not had visitors in some time. Beatrice used to entertain often." Poirot did not interrupt. He let the silence bloom. "She loved the orchard," Miss Langdon continued. "Said the sycamore whispered to her. Of course, that's nonsense. But then what isn't?" I glanced at Poirot, but he merely stirred his tea. "She died in that orchard," Miss Langdon said flatly. 10 years ago, the day before the harvest festival. They said it was an accident." "They?" Poirot asked softly. She did not answer. Instead, she looked out of the window where the leaves turned and turned in the wind. "I suppose I always knew it wasn't." There it was, the first fracture in the calm surface of the village's silence. Poirot stood. "Merci, mademoiselle. That is all I needed for today." And as we left Sycamore House, the wind rose slightly and the old sycamore rustled its limbs. Not loud, not angry, but as if waking from a long, watchful sleep. Chapter 2. Sycamore House. We returned to Sycamore House the following afternoon under a leaden sky that promised rain. The trees lining the path swayed gently, and now and then a brown leaf would break free and tumble downward like a forgotten thought. Poirot had been unusually quiet all morning. He declined his eggs at breakfast and spent much of the day seated in the vicarage parlour reading a worn book of poetry borrowed from Reverend Hallis's shelf. I, for my part, had taken a walk through the village and spoken briefly with the baker's wife, who claimed her flour was late because the miller wouldn't go past the Langdon place after sunset. I had laughed politely, but when I asked why, she simply muttered something about the orchard and pressed a warm loaf into my hands to change the subject. Now, as we stood once more before the iron gate of Sycamore House, Poirot paused. He studied the weathered stone pillars flanking the gate, his eyes narrowing at a faint mark along the base of one, something brushed perhaps with paint. Then, without a word, he pushed the gate open. Nell Langdon was already waiting in the doorway, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Her cardigan was the same as the day before, though now a brooch glinted on the lapel, an enamel sycamore leaf delicately chipped. She gave a faint smile as we approached. "You're early," she said, "but I thought you might come." "You were kind to receive us again," Poirot replied, bowing slightly. This time she led us into the front sitting room. It was a narrow space, full of books, pale curtains, and a fireplace laid but unlit. Upon the mantel rested a photograph of two women seated beneath a tree, their heads turned towards one another in mid-laughter. One was unmistakably Nell, slimmer, younger. The other, with dark, coiled hair and an expression both direct and amused, must have been Beatrice. "She insisted on having that picture framed," Nell said, following my gaze. "Said she wanted it in the house so she could remember when we were still completely ourselves." I never quite understood what she meant. Poirot walked slowly around the room, touching nothing, but taking everything in. His eyes lingered on a small side table where a dried sprig of lavender lay across an unopened copy of Persuasion. Then he stepped to the window. "Your garden," he said quietly. "It has an order to it, though the orchard looks untended." Nell's expression didn't change. "It's only the sycamore I keep clear. The rest can fall as it pleases." Poirot turned. "Why that one?" "Because she sat there," she replied simply. "Every morning in the late summer, she said it helped her think. We had a bench built under it, still there." "And you? Do you sit there as well?" A small hesitation. "Sometimes, when the weather allows." "Do you speak aloud?" She looked at him then, directly. "Yes. Is that part of the inspection?" "Non, mademoiselle," Poirot said softly. "That is part of the morning." Nell did not reply. We remained a while longer. Poirot asked gentle, unintrusive questions: what Beatrice liked to read, where she kept her keys, what she feared. Nell answered with that same dreamlike clarity, though her voice grew steadier as the conversation turned towards practical matters. She had no close relatives. Beatrice, it seemed, had been her only constant companion. As we rose to leave, Poirot paused at the bookshelf and pulled a volume partway out. "Keats," he murmured. "A man who also lived in shadows and autumn." "You and Miss Wynne were fond of him?" "She adored him," Nell replied. "I preferred Rossetti. Keats made her cry." Poirot nodded, returned the book, and gestured for us to depart. Outside, the wind had picked up. The sky was heavy, and somewhere to the east, a rumble of thunder stirred faintly. That evening, I could not sleep. I had not confessed it to Poirot, but something about Sycamore House unsettled me, not in the vulgar way of ghost stories or cheap sensation, but in a quieter, sadder way. There was something profoundly unnatural about the way that grief had settled over the place, as though it had not faded with time, but deepened. At length, I gave up trying to sleep and padded down to the vicarage's kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed the parlour, I saw Poirot seated upright in the armchair, a blanket around his shoulders, not asleep, but still, eyes closed, hands steepled under his chin. "Can't sleep either?" I asked. He opened his eyes. "Non, mon ami, I am listening." "Listening?" Poirot inclined his head slightly toward the window. "Do you hear it?" I listened. There was wind, yes, and the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. "Not really." Poirot smiled faintly. "Of course not, but she speaks at this hour. I am certain of it." I frowned. "You mean Miss Langdon?" "No, Hastings," he said. "I mean Miss Wynne." I started to reply, perhaps with something scoffing or kindly dismissive, but just then something brushed the window pane. A branch, I told myself, a leaf in the wind. But when I looked out, I saw only the orchard beyond, dark and watchful, the sycamore swaying faintly in the dusk. There was no one there. But the sense remained. A presence, not hostile, but waiting. Chapter 3. The Journal Page. The next morning, the air had turned sharp. A silvery mist clung to the rooftops of Maplebridge, and the vicarage garden gleamed with dew. Reverend Hallis had gone early to the church to prepare the chapel for the harvest festival. Poirot remained upstairs, methodically dressing, as was his habit, with the slow deliberation of a man preparing for court. I meanwhile stepped outside with the vague intention of exploring the fields before breakfast. The village was stirring, smoke curled from chimneys, and a milk cart rattled past, the driver raising his cap with a soft, "Mornin', sir." I nodded in return, but my thoughts were already elsewhere, on Sycamore House, on Nell Langdon's distant gaze, and on that peculiar sense of waiting that hung over the orchard like a curtain. I turned toward the eastern lane where the trees arched low, forming a golden tunnel. There, beneath the hedgerow, I saw a figure seated on a flat stone, sketchbook balanced across her knees. It was Isabel Fielding, the schoolmaster's daughter. She looked up as I approached. Her pencil paused mid-stroke. "Oh," she said, a bit startled. Captain Hastings, isn't it?" "Indeed. Out early, I see." She shrugged. "The light's best now, for shadows." She turned the book slightly to show me a fine, shaded pencil sketch of the orchard behind Sycamore House. The sycamore tree loomed large and central, and beneath it sat a woman, faceless but unmistakably still. "It's very good," I said honestly. "Do you sketch often?" "All the time. Papa says it keeps me out of trouble." I smiled at that. Then I noticed she was holding something else in her hand, folded, smudged at the corners. "What's that?" She looked down at it. "Oh, this question mark. I found it caught in the hedge earlier. I thought it might have blown from Sycamore House. It's old. Look." She passed it to me, and I unfolded it carefully. It was a single torn page, the edge uneven, as though ripped hurriedly from a bound book. The handwriting was neat, slanted, and unmistakably feminine. "There is a promise that lives beneath the sycamore. She thinks it died, but I know it breathes. I know what he did, but Nell doesn't, and I can't carry it much longer." There was no signature, no date, just that. I read it twice, then again. "Did you show this to anyone else?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "No," Isabel replied. "Should I have?" "No," I said quickly. "You were quite right to bring it to someone. May I keep it for now?" She nodded and returned to her sketch. As I walked away, I glanced back once. She was already shading in the folds of the woman's skirt beneath the tree. Back at the vicarage, I handed the page to Poirot. He took it silently, his eyes scanning it with the same precision he might apply to a forged will or a bullet trajectory. When he finished, he folded it once more and tapped it gently against his palm. "She," he said softly. "Not he. That is the center of it, Hastings. She thinks it died, but something still breathes, and someone, he, is the reason." "Could it be Beatrice?" I asked. "Writing about Nell?" "Perhaps, but we must not assume. The journal, if that is what it was, is gone, and someone wished it so." "You think it was destroyed?" "I think," Poirot said, standing and straightening his cuffs, "that people destroy only what they fear may be read." That afternoon we paid a visit to the Fielding household. Thomas Fielding answered the door. He was a slender, balding man with a faint stoop and the mild, agreeable manner that comes from decades of managing children's squabbles without raising one's voice. He welcomed us in politely, if a little wearily. We sat in a room lined with bookshelves and maps, a warm fire crackling in the grate. Isabel was upstairs. Her father, when asked about Beatrice Wynne, gave a small, strained smile. "She was very dear to us all," he said, "especially Nell. Their friendship was the kind that we rarely see these days. Quiet, loyal." "Did you know her well, monsieur?" Poirot asked. "Well enough. She was bright, principled, rather intense. I admired her. We were all friends then, of course. Before—" He trailed off, then shook his head. "Forgive me. It's been years. Time doesn't clarify as much as one hopes." "Do you recall," Poirot said, casually enough, "if Miss Wynne kept a journal?" I don't know. Possibly. She wrote often, poetry, letters, all sorts of things. I imagine Nell would know more." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but sometimes those who are closest know the least." Thomas said nothing. As we stood to leave, I noticed a photograph on the mantel, Thomas, his late wife, and a much younger Isabel. But between them, unlabeled and barely distinguishable in the frame, was a fourth figure, Beatrice, I was certain. Smiling faintly, eyes turned just slightly toward Thomas. I said nothing. But Poirot saw it too. His moustache twitched ever so slightly. Later, in the orchard, we stood beneath the great sycamore. The tree's bark was rough and dark, and its canopy still rustled with clinging leaves, though the others in the orchard had already begun to bare their limbs. A wooden bench sat beneath it, worn smooth by time and weather. Upon it lay a dried leaf, curled into itself, and beside it, very faint, nearly invisible, a patch of disturbed earth. Poirot crouched, touched it gently. "Someone was here recently?" "Kneeling?" I offered. perhaps, or burying or unburying. He looked up at the branches, then out toward the horizon where the hills began to rise in the distance. "This is not a place of death," he murmured. "It is a place of keeping." I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but I was beginning to feel what he felt, that truth had been placed somewhere here, in this orchard, under this sky, beneath this very tree. And someone still feared its return. Chapter 4. Questions of Memory. It was just after midday when we returned to Sycamore House. The sky, which had earlier held a soft glow of autumn sun, had since clouded over with a pewter sheen, and a chill wind threaded through the orchard like a whisper through a closed door. A scattering of leaves now covered the front steps, and from within came the gentle sound of china being set on a tray. It was Mrs. Finch who answered the door this time. She was a sturdy woman in her 60s, with brisk hands, a face weathered by decades of service, and an expression that hovered somewhere between suspicion and obligation. "Miss Langdon's upstairs resting," she said. "Bit of a headache," she said. Poirot inclined his head. "Ah, then perhaps we might speak with you instead, madame?" She hesitated. "I suppose, but only if it's not about doctors or nonsense." "We are always respectful of nonsense," Poirot replied with a slight smile. "May we come in?" She led us into the small parlour and wiped her hands on her apron before sitting stiffly in the corner armchair. "Nell don't sleep much," she began, even before we'd spoken. "Wanders the orchard before breakfast, talks to that bench like it's a person. It's not right, but I let it be. Everyone needs somewhere to go with their sadness." Poirot, seated gracefully on the edge of the floral settee, nodded. "And do you believe she is unwell?" Mrs. Finch gave a hard look. "She's not mad, if that's what you're asking. She's waiting. She always has been." "For what?" "For someone to tell her the truth, I suppose." Hastings and I exchanged a glance. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Finch, what do you remember about the day Beatrice Wynne died?" There was a long pause. The only sound was the tick of the mantel clock and the faint rustling of a tree branch tapping the window. Mrs. Finch sighed. "It was the morning of the festival. I was making apple cakes in the kitchen. Nell was reading poetry in the orchard. Beatrice came down late. Her eyes were puffy, like she'd been crying, but she brushed me off. Said she had letters to tend to. That was the phrase she used. Odd, now I think of it." Poirot nodded slowly. "And then?" "She went upstairs. I didn't see her again until they found her, under the tree." "Had anyone visited the house that morning?" She hesitated. "Not that I knew of. But the front door's always open in October, for deliveries and such." The post had come earlier. I saw an envelope on the hall table with Beatrice's name on it. Pale blue paper, foreign stamp. But later, nothing. It was gone, burnt, I assumed. "Burnt?" I said. "Why?" She gave me a measured look. "Because the sitting room smelled of smoke when I came back in, and the grate was warm though the fire hadn't been lit." Poirot's moustache gave a faint twitch. "But you did not see the letter again?" Number Nor asked. "There are some things a servant is not meant to inquire about." "But you've wondered," Poirot said gently. She looked at me then, really looked, and said, "For him?" "Who?" Poirot asked softly. Mrs. Finch clamped her lips together. "That's not for me to say." But Poirot didn't press. He simply nodded and stood. "You have been most helpful, madam. I believe Nell will be pleased to know someone remembered the smoke in the grate." She did not rise to see us out. Outside, we walked once more along the edge of the orchard, the trees now trembling in the rising wind. "She knows something," I said. "Or suspects." "Oui," Poirot said, "but she is a loyal creature. Her loyalty is split between truth and protection." "Protection of whom?" "That," Poirot said, "we must discover." He stopped then and turned toward the path that led to the schoolhouse. "Come, Miss Hastings, let us see what the schoolmaster remembers." Thomas Fielding, when we called on him again, seemed less pleased to see us than the first time. He had the air of a man who had expected a polite farewell, but found himself instead facing a second round of questions. We sat once more in his drawing room, the same photograph of the family still perched on the mantel, still unchanged. Poirot looked at it briefly, then returned his gaze to the man himself. "Monsieur," he began, "I must ask you to recall, if it is not too painful, the days leading up to Beatrice Wynne's death." Fielding stiffened. "I'm not sure I understand the purpose of all this." "The purpose is only clarity," Poirot said smoothly. "There is no accusation, but clarity is sometimes the only thing that can soothe a wound." Fielding exhaled. "Very well, it was autumn. The village was busy with preparations. I had my own worries, my wife had been unwell. Isabel was small then, I barely saw Beatrice except at church. But Nell came by once, I remember. She brought some of Beatrice's homemade jam." Poirot tilted his head. "And you were close to Miss Wynne once, were you not?" Fielding's jaw tightened. "We were friends." Poirot said nothing. After a long pause, the schoolmaster added, "She was a remarkable woman, intense, private, but full of light in her way. I sometimes think Nell lived in her shadow." Poirot's voice was quiet. "Did she?" "I don't mean anything cruel, only that Beatrice was the one people noticed. Nell followed, or waited." There was no venom in his words, but no warmth either. Poirot stood. "Thank you, monsieur. You have helped more than you know." As we walked away from the house, Hastings finally said what had clearly been lingering in his mind. "Do you think they were lovers?" Poirot glanced at him. "Possibly, but even if not, what they shared was deeper than ordinary friendship. When such bonds break, Hastings, they do not shatter like glass. They warp the air around them like heat." That night, the wind howled outside the vicarage. I did not sleep. Instead, I sat in the darkened parlour, the torn journal page in my lap, the fire dwindling to embers. I thought of Nell, of Beatrice, of the bench beneath the sycamore, and of the single phrase that would not leave me. "I know what he did." But Nell doesn't. Poirot entered quietly just after midnight, his slippers soundless on the rug. "She was writing to herself," he said, sitting across from me. "Or perhaps to both of them, a final record. To accuse? To confess." He looked at me then, grave and gentle. "We are closer now, mon ami. The orchard does not lie, but someone else, someone still alive, does." Chapter 5. The Housekeeper's Truth. Rain came that morning, soft and persistent. It beaded on the windows of the vicarage and painted the cobbled lane outside in shades of slate and silver. Reverend Hallis had gone to the church for bell practice, and Poirot sat in the parlour with a biscuit untouched beside his teacup, his gaze fixed on the condensation gathering in delicate patterns across the window pane. He had been silent since breakfast. At last he said, "Today we ask her again." "You mean Mrs. Finch?" "Oui, her heart is full. She has carried it too long. It has made her heavy." Half an hour later, we were once more at Sycamore House. The parlour smelled faintly of old raincoats and beeswax polish. Nell Langdon, pale and still, had retreated upstairs after a restless night. It was Mrs. Finch who let us in, her apron damp from tending to something in the scullery. She didn't speak as we removed our coats. She simply turned and walked to the hearth, where she stoked the fire with unnecessary vigour. Poirot sat without invitation. "Madame," he said gently, "we have come not to disturb Miss Langdon, but to ask you one question, one only." She turned, stiff and watchful. He continued, "What happened to the letter?" Mrs. Finch stared at him, her eyes narrowed and her lips pressed together in a line. "You know the one I mean," Poirot added, "pale blue, foreign stamp, addressed to Miss Wynne." For a long moment she did not move, the fire crackled softly behind her. Then, with a suddenness that startled me, she sat down hard and placed her hands in her lap. I burned it. There. The first real fracture. Poirot said nothing. He did not lean forward, did not blink. He let the confession rest. "I found it on the table," she went on, her voice low. "The morning Miss Beatrice died. She'd come down early, but she didn't take her tea, just went back up. I thought it odd. Then I saw the envelope, pale blue, like you said. I didn't read it, but I saw the handwriting, and I knew." "Knew what?" I asked. Mrs. Finch glanced at me. There was pity in her gaze. "I knew it was from him, from Mr. Fielding." Poirot gave a soft sigh. "And you feared what it might say?" "I knew what it would say. I'd seen it building. The way he looked at her, once. And then the way he stopped. Quietly. All those months where she kept hoping. And he just grew colder. And when his wife fell ill," she shook her head. "There was no room for Beatrice in his tidy life. That letter would have killed her." "So you burned it before she could read it?" Mrs. Finch's eyes filled. No tears fell, but the sheen was there. "I thought I was protecting her, but I was too late. She must have read it already, or guessed. She went into the orchard, and she never came back." "You told no one?" "What was there to tell? A dead woman and a burnt letter?" the village whispered. "They always whisper." But no one wanted the truth. Not really. They wanted it tidy. Poirot nodded, slow and sombre. "And Miss Langdon?" She blamed herself. She thought Beatrice was tired or sick or grieving something she couldn't name, and I let her believe it, because what good would the truth have done? Poirot folded his hands. "The truth, madame, does not always arrive to do good, but it always arrives." We left Mrs. Finch in the parlour, staring into the fire, the weight of years having finally shifted just slightly from her shoulders. Outside, the rain had eased into a fine mist. The orchard glistened. Poirot was quiet as we walked. Then he said, "We are near the core now, Hastings." "I feel it too," I replied. "But why would Beatrice go out to the orchard if she had already read the letter? Why not confront him?" "She went not to confront," Poirot said, "but to decide." "Decide what?" Poirot looked at me with unexpected sadness. Whether the world was still worth living in without the one she loved. That afternoon, at Poirot's gentle insistence, we returned to Sycamore House, but not to speak. Instead, we asked permission to visit the attic. Mrs. Finch, oddly subdued, simply gestured to the staircase. The attic was not grand. Bare wooden beams, a sloped ceiling, and a single window clouded with age. The smell was of dry paper and mothballs, and somewhere beneath that, lavender. There were boxes of books, trunks of clothing, old holiday decorations, and 2 wooden chests marked with faded initials. It was Hastings, not Poirot, who found the book. A slim volume of Keats, spine cracked and page edges worn. It was tucked into the back of a drawer beneath a stack of linen. The cover was clean, but as I lifted it, something slipped out, a thin, brittle envelope. Not blue, charred, almost entirely blackened, but on the reverse, barely legible, the name Miss Beatrice Wynne. Poirot took it in gloved hands. He turned it carefully, and though the contents were mostly ash, a few scorched words remained on the flap. "I cannot marry you." That was all. Poirot did not smile. He did not nod. He merely closed the book, replaced the envelope inside it, and cradled the volume in his arms. "Someone tried to erase it," I said. Poirot's voice was quiet. But even ashes carry shape. That evening, back at the vicarage, we sat before the fire. I asked Poirot what he would do next. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing?" "For now. The orchard will tell us more, but the time must be right." And so we waited. Outside, the wind rattled the trees, and the sycamore, dark against the evening sky, bowed its branches low, as if remembering someone who had once sat beneath it, with a letter in her hand and a heart already breaking. Chapter 6. The Letter in the Book. It was Hastings who noticed it first. We had returned from Sycamore House the next morning, rain having ceased, though the sky still hung low and heavy. At the vicarage, I found Isabel Fielding seated cross-legged near the hearth, sketchbook open, a book of poetry lying beside her. She looked up as we entered and held up her drawing. "This one's for Miss Langdon," she said, her voice uncertain. "I saw her yesterday. She looked so still. I thought maybe if she saw the orchard through someone else's eyes—" Poirot stepped forward, adjusting the lapels of his impeccable jacket. "May I?" She nodded. He studied the pencil lines with unusual gravity. Beneath the sycamore sat two women, one drawn in precise detail, the other in outline only. The shading was light, suggestive of presence, not form. "You have given her back what was taken," Poirot said softly. Isabel blushed and glanced down. "I just wanted her to see that someone still remembers." Poirot touched the page gently, then looked at the book lying on the floor beside her. It was a tattered volume of Christina Rossetti's poems. "You like Rossetti?" Isabel shrugged. "She makes sadness feel almost beautiful." Poirot's expression changed very slightly. "May I?" he asked, and picked up the book. As he turned the pages, something small and folded fell from the inner spine. He caught it before it hit the floor. It was a letter, not an original, a copy carefully written by hand, a transcription. Isabel looked startled. That was there. Poirot's brow furrowed as he unfolded it. It was addressed in elegant handwriting to Beatrice. The letter read, "My dear B, forgive me. I am a coward. I cannot face the life I promised. She is ill, and I am all she has. You will survive without me. You always do. You are stronger than you know, but I am not brave enough to choose you over duty. Yours, always." Poirot read it twice. Then gently, he asked Isabel, "Child, where did you get this book?" Isabel frowned. "From Papa's shelf. Ages ago. I thought the poems were sad and pretty. I never saw the letter before." Poirot handed it to me. It was almost too much to absorb at once. The handwriting matched what little had survived on the burnt envelope. It was, unmistakably, a farewell. Not violent, not cruel, but utterly decisive. "This is the original," I whispered. "No," Poirot said, shaking his head. "The original burned. This is someone's copy, preserved deliberately, for remembrance, or perhaps for penance." Isabel looked from one of us to the other. "I don't understand." Poirot sat beside her. "Who had access to that shelf, mademoiselle? Who knew that book belonged to Beatrice? Who transcribed the words so carefully?" Isabel was silent. Then she said, very softly, "Papa told me not to take books from the high shelf, especially the ones with flowers pressed inside. I thought he meant they were fragile." Poirot's face did not change, but something settled behind his eyes. "Your father has lived many years with this memory," he said gently, and in his own way he tried to carry it, but the one person who needed to see these words never did. That afternoon, Poirot returned to Sycamore House alone. I stayed behind, feeling, as I often did during such moments, that I was not needed. Instead, I sat in the vicarage garden and watched the last of the apples fall from the tree. Children ran up and down the village road with baskets and ribbons, preparing for the harvest festival. Their joy seemed impossibly distant from the truth that had unfolded over the past few days. When Poirot returned, his expression was unreadable. "She read it," he said simply. "Nell?" She read the letter from the book. She did not cry, she did not speak. She simply folded it once and said, "So I was right to wait." I didn't know what to say to that. Poirot stood at the window, watching the breeze stir the garden. "There is a peculiar cruelty in incomplete love, Hastings. It lingers like fog, never clear enough to explain, never faint enough to forget." "You think she'll be all right?" Poirot turned. She has not broken, not even in all these years. She has simply become quiet. And sometimes the quiet ones hold the heaviest truths. That evening, just before dusk, Poirot and I walked through the orchard one last time. The light was amber, rich and low, and the sycamore tree glowed faintly with what leaves still clung to its limbs. At the base of the tree the bench had been cleaned. Upon it lay the sketch Isabel had made, set inside a simple wooden frame. And beside it, a teacup, freshly washed, empty. Poirot stood still, then reached into his coat and removed the tattered envelope we had found in the attic. He placed it gently on the bench beneath the frame. "No one else need read it," he said, "but it should remain here. Let her have the whole of it." We turned then and walked away. Behind us, the wind stirred again, but there were no more secrets in its song, only memory, and the quiet, steady breath of peace returning. Chapter 7. The Harvest Festival. The bells of St. Martin's rang just before noon, their echo drifting lazily over the thatched rooftops and gold-dappled lanes of Maplebridge. The autumn sun had, at last, found its courage. It warmed the trestle tables laid out with cider jugs, plated loaves, and jars of plum preserve. Bunting fluttered overhead, children darted between hay bales. Everything was as it had been for decades, and yet something was different. For the first time in years, Miss Nell Langdon stood in the village square. She wore a neat grey coat and a simple brooch, an enamel sycamore leaf polished to its former shine. Her steps were quiet, her hands clasped loosely, but her presence did not go unnoticed. The villagers, who had grown so accustomed to passing her house in silence, looked up and nodded. Some smiled, awkwardly. Some looked away. Beside her stood Poirot, utterly composed, his gloved hands behind his back. I followed a few steps behind, scanning the square with a soldier's instinct, though I knew this battlefield was of the heart, not the body. "I should not be here," Nell whispered. Her voice was calm, not fearful. "You are exactly where you belong," Poirot said gently. "Today is for the harvest. What is the harvest if not the result of patience?" She gave a faint smile. Beatrice would have laughed at that. "She would have insisted on better biscuits," Poirot replied. The stalls filled quickly as the brass band struck up a cheerful but oddly wavering tune. I spotted Thomas Fielding arranging a tray of spiced buns near the school table, Isabel helping him with ribbon-festooned jars. His collar was slightly askew, and his gaze flickered often, toward the orchard, then toward Nell. At exactly 2 o'clock, Poirot suggested we take tea in the orchard. I blinked. "You mean now? With everyone here?" "Precisely now," he said, "when the silence would be most noticed." Nell said nothing, but when Poirot turned, she followed. The orchard shimmered in the low afternoon light. Tables had been set up there too for elderflower cordial and apple cake. A scattering of villagers drifted between the trees. But as Poirot led Nell toward the sycamore, a quietness seemed to fall, not of discomfort, but of attention. They sat together on the bench. From where I stood, I could not hear what Poirot said at first, only the rhythm of his voice, steady and precise. Then I saw Thomas Fielding approach. He walked slowly, not from reluctance, but with the gravity of someone approaching an altar. In his hand he carried something, a book, slim, familiar, Rossetti. Nell saw it. She stood. For a moment the orchard was utterly still. Then he spoke, low, just above the whisper of leaves. I moved a little closer. "I found it after she died," Thomas said. "She'd pressed a poem inside about second chances. I read it that night. Then I found her copy of my letter. She must have written it out, or kept it hidden. I couldn't bear to show it to you. I thought I'd already failed her once. I didn't want to fail you too." "You failed us both," Nell said, not cruelly, just as a fact. "I know." There was silence again. Then she said, "Why didn't you come to me?" "I was a coward," she nodded. "Yes, but so was I." The words were not dramatic, not loud, but they passed through the orchard like a bell. Poirot stepped back and turned to me. "Voila," he said softly. "That is the moment, the first truth spoken aloud." And indeed it was as though something old had shifted in the ground beneath that tree. As though Beatrice, wherever she rested, had finally been invited to leave behind the ache she'd planted in this place. Later, back in the square, Reverend Hallis gave his brief address. He thanked the villagers for their community spirit, for their bakes and harvest wreaths. He made no mention of what had just occurred, but Nell was still standing among them. She bought a jar of quince jelly from the baker's daughter. She tasted cider. And when Isabel offered her a drawing of two women under a sycamore, she accepted it with both hands, eyes shining but clear. "She's healing," I said to Poirot as we watched her. "Not healing," he corrected. "Becoming whole. There is a difference." "And Fielding? He will bear his guilt, but now he knows he is not the only one who remembers. It may be enough." That evening, we returned to the orchard one final time. The sunlight was amber, the branches black against it. Poirot placed the Rossetti book on the bench, beside the sketch. He did not speak. Then from his pocket, he took a single sycamore leaf, freshly fallen, and placed it atop the book. We stood a moment longer, then turned away. Behind us, the wind moved softly through the trees. And at last, it no longer sounded like someone waiting. It sounded like someone resting. Chapter 8. Beneath the Sycamore. The next morning dawned clear. The air, so often drowsy with mist in Maplebridge, felt newly rinsed. The light poured over the village rooftops in soft gold, catching the chimney pots, the garden gates, the final amber leaves clinging to the orchard trees. The harvest festival had ended, the bunting folded away, and the scent of spiced apples lingered only faintly on the breeze. Poirot and I stood once more at the edge of the orchard. The sycamore tree remained where it always had, steadfast, ancient, and no longer haunted by silence. "I suppose it's finished then," I said. Poirot, hands behind his back, nodded slowly. "Oui, mon ami. But not in the way one usually means it." He turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You see, there was no killer here, no dagger, no poison. Not even a lie told aloud. The crime was silence. And its wound was grief." I looked toward Sycamore House, where the curtains had been drawn back. Miss Langdon stood quietly in the upstairs window, gazing down toward the orchard. Her figure was calm, almost still, but no longer ghost-like. She was present. She was here. "She will never know everything," Poirot continued. "There are parts of Beatrice's heart that remain in shadow, but she knows enough. She knows she was loved, and that she was not the one left behind in error." He paused. "That knowledge is more precious than justice. It is the only cure for the ache that comes from not being chosen." "And Thomas?" I asked. Poirot smiled faintly. "He will carry the weight, but no longer in secret. He knows now what Nell bore alone. That changes a man. I believe he will find gentleness again. Perhaps with his daughter, perhaps in time, with Miss Langdon herself." It struck me then how rare this was for Poirot to involve himself so deeply in the after. He was usually content with the solving, the truth revealed in a drawing room with gasps and confessions. But here, in Maplebridge, he had done none of that. He had revealed no villain, summoned no constables, only ushered a slow, steady light toward a wound grown mossy with age. He had helped people remember without tearing them apart. "I used to think," I said, "that only the violent things required investigation. But this might be the quietest case we've ever touched." Poirot nodded. "Ah, but quiet grief, Hastings, is the most dangerous kind. It festers, it distorts memory, it builds whole houses of silence around a single, unanswered question. Sometimes the detective must act not as a judge, but as a key." I glanced at him. "To unlock? To unlock what was locked away, and to let the ghosts walk out on their own. We visited Sycamore House once more before leaving. Nell greeted us at the door herself. She wore the same grey coat as before, but her hair was tied more neatly, and her eyes were clearer than I had ever seen them. "You'll be leaving soon?" she asked. "Yes," Poirot replied, "but I wish to say farewell, and to leave you with something." He reached into his coat pocket and removed a small object carefully wrapped in linen. He handed it to her. She unwrapped it slowly. It was the charred envelope, the one we had recovered from the attic. She stared at it a moment. "I thought it had vanished," she said. Poirot inclined his head. "Things do not always vanish, mademoiselle. Sometimes they are merely waiting." She held it carefully, reverently, and then she said, "I think I'll keep it, not to reread, but to remind me." "Of what?" She smiled. "That I was not forgotten." Poirot bowed his head. We left her standing in the doorway, framed by climbing ivy and falling light. The train back to London was half empty. Poirot sat by the window, his gloves folded neatly in his lap. Outside, the countryside rolled past in sepia tones, cows grazing, fields turning, the seasons shifting almost imperceptibly from harvest to rest. "You know," I said, "we never really explained how Beatrice died." "We did," he replied. "We just did not name it. She fell or jumped." "She decided," he said simply. With sorrow, with clarity, and perhaps with a sense of release. "The manner is unimportant. The truth lies in what she believed when she went to the orchard, and in what she left behind." I nodded, feeling unusually heavy with thought. Poirot turned from the window and looked at me kindly. "You are wondering, mon ami, why this case moved you so?" "Yes," I admitted. "It's not like the others. No guilt to punish, no villain to outwit. Just pain and time, and a letter." He nodded. "Because it was not a puzzle of evidence, but of hearts, and the heart, Hastings, is the most mysterious instrument of all." As the train pulled us toward the city once more, I closed my eyes and pictured the orchard, the sycamore, and the woman who had waited beneath it, first for answers, then for peace. And in the rustling of the wind, I thought I could still hear it. Not a whisper of longing, but the gentle hush of letting go. Financial.